Hello again. It is exactly 11:30, and we go to the second panel. Increasingly, we are seeing less determination by nations to get into direct confrontation. Rather, that conflict has moved to economics, technologies, social engineering and manipulation, and of course, hybrid warfare. Sun Tzu once said, a long, long time ago, supreme excellence consists of breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. Today, we see strike forces with no national insignias, initiating chaos and political destabilization. Terrorism has become the new norm, and undefined conflict is perhaps the future. How do we battle this chaos? The next panel discussion is led by Mrs. Dalia Bankauskaitė. She is a partnership associate professor at Vilnius University in the communication faculty and a non-resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, D.C. Her research focuses on the concept of total defense, namely, the whole of society approach in building societal resilience by mobilizing and motivating society. She has extensive professional experience in strategic communication here in Lithuania, Ukraine, Georgia, otherwise known as Sakartvelo, and the entire Baltic Sea region. I'd like to introduce Dr. Dalia Bankauskaitė, and the topic is Chaos as a Strategy, How Authoritarian Powers Fight Against Democracies. Please.
Runas, thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm the moderator of this panel, and I'd like to welcome you all on our virtual conversation on chaos as a strategy, how authoritarian powers might fight against democracies. To frame our discussion, I would like to toss out some quick observations. The chaos as a strategy is not new. In history, there are many examples of chaos strategies that core of which is to further the political goals by fostering the politics of disorder on the opponent. Since 2014, the international democratic community does not question whether the authoritarian regimes such as Russia and China make efforts to carry influence operations, but rather what influence or interference operations are carried out and what tactics were and are applied. The COVID pandemic period, unfortunately, is marked by the extensive disinformation and information and cyber actions against the democratic countries, sometimes combined with payments by investment or corruption. The geopolitical objectives of autocratic regimes include undermining liberal democratic norms and institutions, reducing other democracies' global influence, weakening cohesion among democratic allies and partners, and advancing their own interests. As recent CEPA report notes, the authoritarian regimes, Russia or China, believe that their autocratic regimes grant them a natural competitive advantage in managing politics. Russia's approach is confrontational, destructive, and often secret, clandestine. China's influence operates in a more subtle way, patient and more risk-adverse than Russia. Russia seeks to strengthen itself in relative terms by weakening the West, while China seeks to strengthen itself in absolute terms. The aim of this panel is first to discuss the influence and interference operations of the autocratic regimes against the liberal democracies. Second, to consider how Western powers should bear against the authoritarian regimes. And with that, I will introduce our panelist. Dr. Florian Hartleb is a German political expert and specialist based in Tallinn, Estonia, lecturer at the Catholic University Eichstätt, and member of an expert group for the Parliament of Lower Saxony. He is an author of various books and has foreseen important concerns for security, such as the rise of populism and recent global and virtual challenges of it. Linas Kojala, director of Eastern European Studies Center, a think tank in Lithuania. Also, Linas works as a non-resident expert at Davis Center, Harvard University. His research interests include foreign affairs, foreign relations of Russia and United States, European integration, security and NATO studies, information security. Third panelist is Justinas Linkevičius, a PhD candidate at the Institute of International Relations and Political Science, Vilnius University. His research is focused on emerging technology and changing security environment. Justinas owes a number of publications on Lithuania's foreign and security policy, security perception of small states, and NATO. Lieutenant Colonel Valerijus Šerelis, Director of Institute of Military Studies, Lithuanian Armed Forces. Luckily, Valerijus is next to me. He's a chair of Military Terminology Commission as well. Valerijus started his military service in 1991. Since then, has occupied various positions, served in Lithuania, Afghanistan, Iraq, taught the nature of insurgents and counterinsurgents courses at Baltic Defense College, Tartu, Estonia. Welcome all. So the way I want to structure this panel is to keep it interactive and do a couple of round questions for our panelists before we field questions from our virtual audiences. Florian, let's begin with you. You run an extensive research in the rise of pluralism. And if yes, why the model of liberal democracies lost its attractiveness after the early 1990s euphoria, the victory of liberal democracies, as Fukuyama used to express. And if it is related, could you briefly touch upon the populism of today? Is populism a key element both of democratic and autocratic systems?
Yeah, labas rytas, Suaite, welcome from Tallinn. Thank you very much for inviting me. And first of all, I would like to address to the topic how authoritarian powers fight against democracies. It means the topic of our panel that the authoritarian powers are first and the democracies are the second. And actually, this came just in my mind after reading this half an hour ago. And basically, this is the worldwide tendency, what we can observe in some studies from where the World Value Survey, from studies from Ronald Inglehart. And we can see there a global trend. And if you are referring to Francis Fukuyama with his thesis of the victory of liberal democracy, also combined maybe with euphoria here in the Baltic states with the independence, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, with the end of the communism, the last book of Professor Fukuyama was about identity. And basically, this shows already the turn. Another example maybe is Viktor Orban, in Hungary, who basically 1988, with 26 years, he said the Soviet troops should go out of Hungary. Orban started his political career at the beginning of the 90s as a liberal, and now, a couple of weeks ago, Viktor Orban is not member of the biggest, strongest force in Europe, the EPP, the European People's Party. So this already shows actually that the liberal democracies are under fire, are under attack. And that's why maybe you have chosen that the authoritarian powers are in front of the liberal democracies. And why this model is losing its attractiveness? There is a decline of the trust towards the political institutions, certainly. Secondly, there is a new turn of having these identity issues. I just referred before to the latest book of Fukuyama, and the Bulgarian intellectual Ivan Krastev just wrote a book about the COVID-19 pandemic. And in this book, I just was reading that there is a point, what he's saying, that we have a kind of renationalization because every country is counting its own deaths and infections. And I'm speaking in Estonia, where the COVID-19 pandemic was basically ignored. A couple of weeks ago, the shopping malls were open. And now we are number one in the world here in Estonia. So basically, there is this Darwinist struggles about how to deal with a pandemic. Then secondly, we have this renationalization because all the people are counting their own infection rates and are relying to their own experts. Coming to the second point.
Florian, may I just quickly interrupt you? We can't see you. Could you turn off your camera if it is possible? And please continue. Sorry to interfere.
It should be, at least I see myself and I turned on my camera.
Okay. So we hear, at least we hear you. We don't see you, but we hear you.
This is a pity.
Yes, but please continue because it's more important what you have to say. Yeah.
I'm sorry for that, because I see myself. Maybe we can check this after answering your second question in between.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm sorry for that. I never had such a issue. Yeah.
Now
but coming.
Now we see you. Now it's excellent.
Oh, no, finally. So, Labas Ritas again. Second greetings, and coming to the second question. Sorry for that. Populism. It's a key basic term which is discussed. First, it was discussed 1967 in a conference at the London School of Economics. And it's still an ongoing debate. Is it kind of ideology or is it a political strategy? Or what the leading researcher, Cas Mudde, is saying, is it kind of a Finn-centered ideology? And after I made this PhD, or my PhD 2004, I'm dealing with these questions actually. And I would say that populism is an element for both, because populism is linked with also recently in the last years with a kind of a business strategy, with entrepreneurship. We saw with Donald Trump, but we have also many other examples in Czech Republic, for example. We had it in the 90s with Silvio Berlusconi in Italy. And certainly this populism saying I'm outside of politics, I'm fighting against the political elites, I'm referring to the taboo topics, I'm having this in-group against the out-group, which is also kind of a strategy to divide the society, to find some enemies. I think this is a phenomenon which you can apply to both. So we saw also in the recent elections in Brazil, we saw it in Philippines, we saw it in US, and we saw it in many other countries in Europe, that this is a kind of a winning formula, a successful political tool. And this is also linked with a new area of political communication. And we saw basically how important this social media communication is. Maybe one small private remark about that. When I'm starting my university seminars, then my first question is to my student, do we have any kind of newspapers at home? Do we have any kind of prints? And there's nothing. So basically, even the young generation exclusively is getting the information via echo chambers, via filter boxes. And this is actually the new trend in this political communication. We have a kind of hysteria. We're thinking now our democracy is over. We had this debate 2009, 2010 within the economic crisis. We had the same debate 2015, 2016 with the refugee crisis, and now we have the same debate since the last year with the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florian. It seems that We have a problem of identity, as Florian said. We have populism that has enough of place, attractive thing, and moreover, there's technologies that lock us or keeps us into certain, and then we prefer to stay in certain echo chambers. Question to you, Valerius, how would you define this strategy of chaos nowadays then?
Good morning, everybody. First of all, I would like to say that I'm a military thinker and I will share my own thoughts. And if somebody is going to be blamed for what I will say, it's me, but not a chain of command above me. I'm still thinking about career. So back to the question, concept of chaos. It came from ancient Greek. And basically, etymologically, it means nothingness, emptiness, darkness, disorder. But all the ancient Greek gods actually comes from chaos. And even linguistically, chaos and Zeus sound alike. So it's not only disorder. It's disorder and opportunities at the same time. And when we're talking about definitions and perceptions, we have to compare perceptions. Perception of the West and perception of the East. If West perceived chaos as a stage or subphase between peace and the crisis, like just before the crisis, and we're talking about crisis response operations, crisis response measures, the East actually sees it as an opportunity to exploit for the next step, for something else. Then probably the word strategy is not really fits together with the chaos. Probably word policy of chaos would be more convenient, like way of the implementation. Because in the military, we are actually everything structured, strategy, operations, tactics, levels of war. And if we are talking about frameworks, ends, ways, means, what we want, how we are going to achieve it, and what we would need for it. So, in a chaos is a kind of condition from which something is going to happen, and then it means our self-protection have to be counter-chaos operation, if I may. Jumping back to the tactics, it's a semi-joke. Marshals running to the Emperor Napoleon and saying, "Emperor, we are surrounded." And Napoleon is answering, "Perfect, now we can attack in any direction." Getting back to the chaos, Chairman Mao says, everything under the sun is chaos, situation is excellent. So it is kind of decisive condition which is on the line of operation and leads to the operational objective. And a perception between East and West, and I'm not talking about China here at all. I have extract with me in Russian language of Russian Federation military doctrine. And the word безопасность we're actually translating into English like security. But actually it means без опасности, without a danger. In the military doctrine of Russian Federation, actually there is a list of dangers, list of the threats. There are definitions, what is a danger, what is a threat. And actually you see that the danger may become a threat. So the danger exists all the time, but not always becoming a threat. And especially interesting part is характерные черты и особенности современных военных конфликтов. So it's kind of description of the contemporary military conflicts. There is some of them, but complex use of military power, political, economical, information, other things. And then, like another line, с широким использованием протестного потенциала местного населения и сил специальных операций. So it means a protesting potential of population is a tool. Another very interesting participation of irregular units and private military companies. We actually have a joke in armed forces that it actually means 2 Wagners, 10 Vatniks, and we do have a problem. The next one, I would read it in English because in Russian, because I like it especially. Применение непрямых и асимметричных способов действий, which in English means using indirect and asymmetric approaches. That's strange, because it's direct translation from the Western publications. Strategy of indirect approach by Little Hart, and so on. But Russian language have another word to describe indirect. It's, let's say, indirect influence would be in Russian, in original Russian, косвенное воздействие. So it means indirect, and reading this paper, I was thinking, they knew that we are going to read it, and they wanted to perceive it as we perceived it, but not as they. So you have to know culture, you have to know language to understand the differences in perceptions. And the point K in the same description, it's a use of finance from abroad, political and societal movements. So the toolbox for organizing chaos, information influence, and so on, everything is written in doctrine. But reading is not enough. It has to be interpreted and explained in a context of comparison of the perceptions. And even the word безопасность, when I was teaching cadets in the Military Academy of Lithuania, we were discussing what is a threat, what is a danger. So the dog in the yard is a danger, but the dog is on the chain and the gates are closed. So it is a danger. If the dog is free of the chain and the gates are open, it's possibly a threat. If you're coming in, you're actually accepting risk. So neurolinguistically, безопасность means there is no dog, or this dog cannot bite and cannot bark. Then it's безопасность. So this kind of chaos, it's kind of sublime messaging in creating conditions for the next level or escalation of the disorder. So I think I will stop here with the definition.
Well, thank you. You leave me with the understanding that chaos is really an opportunity as well. And that reminds me of really a story, whether to have Königsberg, which means order, or to have Kaliningrad, which means chaos. So perhaps there's opportunities in the situation. Justinas, I would like to ask you about continuing the topic of nowadays. We live in extremely technologically stuffed times, and I think never before humanity lived these times. So how emerging technologies change and create new security issues, and maybe opportunities, or maybe threats, as Valerio says. What are the vulnerabilities for the security? What trends? Could you share your insights? Thank you.
Good day, everyone. Firstly, can you see and hear me?
Yes, 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 we do.
Excellent, excellent. Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to be here, though remotely. And broader reflections or ideas about the technologies and the security perception and security environment. And when I talk about technologies, I mainly have in mind technologies based on artificial intelligence. And I'm not speaking about like super intelligence or robots that, in my personal opinion, they will be quite in a far future. But the artificial intelligence, which is basically algorithms that are programmed to perform tasks by pulling certain information from the specific data set. And it is already in our daily lives. And just to give an example, I think most of us use social media, and if we just follow certain groups, or we search for certain information, or we watch certain videos, for example, on YouTube, we get suggestions, we get additional ads. So it means that artificial intelligence, which sits in those platforms, it collects various information about ourselves, about our preferences, interests, our location, and then generates that information or those suggestions that we get. So we define it as a narrow AI, which as I already mentioned, is quite already in our daily lives. And the conceptual question here is, so when we have this human algorithm interaction, so who then is at risk? Is it a individual and human being who might be misled by deep fake information or disinformation? Is it society that can be divided, or its cohesion can be damaged? Is it a political order that we would like to protect fundamental rights, human rights that also we want to protect? Or is it all at the same time? And this point brings to another point that I think that already with the discussion on hybrid threats and terrorism, we moved our perception of security to thinking from security as only like military and territory protection based understanding to much more complex and heterogeneous security perception. And what the technologies and data-driven technologies show that countries move towards technological competitiveness, which become a new national power. And data, accessibility to that data becomes a new source of power. And this is, of course, leads us to another issue of increased uncertainty, because this uncertainty comes from not knowing and those new risks or different risks that I've tried to mention earlier. And here in this kind of blurred situation, I think another very important and specific question is, so how these technologies based on artificial intelligence and data use, how they are governed, and what are the differences here? And we already can observe quite different approach between democracies and authoritarian regimes, because the later ones, authoritarian regimes, they really use this to form and maybe construct this kind of ruleless atmosphere where you can collect the data, you can collect the information, and use it as a source, as a new source of your influence, not only domestically, but also the way of increasing your influence abroad. And this kind of new state control high-tech regime is one of the new phenomena that we can already observe, and we already can hear these kind of concepts as digital authoritarianism, which is basically about enabling those digital technologies to surveil, suppress, and constrain human behavior. So controlling that, getting the information you want, accessing that information, and using it to advance your technologies, state-controlled technologies, again to pursue your power. So maybe I can stop here, and then maybe we can discuss that a bit later. Thanks.
Justinas, thank you. This is what you leave us with quite a strong thought that technologies give it's a new source of power and a new source of national power. Actually, usually we perceive, we think, or we know already that's new normal, that social platforms, technologies are after our time and attention. And they chase us, they follow us, and they lock us into certain chambers, they channel us. But really it's also a source of a national power. Linus, I would like to ask you as a researcher of Russian-USA, China-USA foreign relations. I trust that you would agree that relations between those countries, democratic countries and autocracy, is a confrontation of democracy and autocracy. But is it this clash purely economic and technological, or first of all, it is also a conflict of values? How would you describe, assess the relationship US-China, US-Russia? Thank you.
Thank you, Dalia. Thank you, organizers, for having us all together, even though only virtually, but I think it's still a very valuable experience for all of us to be participants of this conference. So I would like to make probably 2 points following your question by emphasizing probably that it's impossible to talk about the current political world without discussing at least somewhat the ideas aspect. And probably the trouble for democracy nowadays, it's the fact that it's losing its normative attraction, that it's doubtful of itself. And one of the arguments in that direction is probably a survey which was relatively recently published by Pew Research. It was a survey of 34 countries. And the result is, unfortunately, I think unfortunately, a very negative one. 52% of participants, the median result is 52%, say that democracy is not capable of solving today's problems. Basically two-thirds of people surveyed in those countries say that politicians, political leaders do not care about the common people, are again unable to solve the issues. So democracy as a normative idea, as a goal to reach for those who are not yet democratic or just recently having the system, is a big trouble. Because if you live in a world where you also have alternatives for democracy and alternatives that tend to portray themselves as extremely efficient and effective in terms of economic growth, in terms of tackling global or regional issues such as the pandemic, in terms of making less of a mess of their political decision making, obviously only on surface, but that's what majority of people see. Then again, it's a big problem, because democracy as a normative idea is crucial to have the world of post-World War II and post-Cold War, which has moved towards more market access, which has moved towards more stronger human rights protection, which has moved towards efficient cooperation among countries rather than conflict and confrontation. So that's the first point I would like to make. And the second point is, well, democracies always struggle between those two aspects, and those aspects are interests and values. So on the one hand, we face today a challenge of, for instance, discussing whether we need a new pipeline with a country that is certainly not democratic and is not following the norms and rules of the international order. We also have to discuss whether we need market access to a very huge and increasingly rich market, or whether we should focus on the fact that this market also is surrounded by the political system, which is unfortunately using its powers to suppress another political opinion, which is used also to suppress certain minorities living in certain parts of a specific country, and etc. So that's the question that I think Americans tend to have an answer to. We see that even though United States political system is extremely polarized on any aspect, basically, the parties tend to more or less agree on issues related to Russia or issues related to China, and we see a lot of continuation with Biden's administration, even though he has probably not a lot of things in common with the previous US administration. But Europe is, as in Sinatra's song, trying to find its own way. So whether we can find our own way, which is sustainable, which has the right balance between values and interests, and that takes into account geopolitical aspects of this competition, sometimes possibly confrontation, and sometimes possibly cooperation. I'm not yet sure. It's probably an ongoing discussion, and all of us are more or less participating in it, but it's a discussion that demands answers in the foreseeable future, because without being able to answer such question, we will probably not be able to form necessary policies to tackle a lot of different today's challenges. So thank you very much.
Linas, thank you very much. We've got very precise definition. Democratic regime is a norm. We should approach as a normative idea, and then as a clear distinction between interest and values, and how those two issues and concepts could coexist. Moreover, how that could be implemented, exercised. I would like to come here to Justinas, back to Justinas, and ask about Justinas, about your research. Your research focus is digital autocracy or authoritarianism. Sorry, I don't pronounce this word. Authoritarianism. What is digital authority or authoritarianism means, and what are its key features? How it involves?
Yes, thank you for the question. It's rather interesting concept now, and probably the life example can be the best answer that. So as I mentioned, this digital authoritarianism is basically about surveilling, repressing, and controlling the public using the technology. So, and in this case, I would say that China is leading because we see quite a massive surveillance controlling the citizens. And for example, what artificial intelligence has allowed, it has allowed to develop technologies based on facial recognition, which is very, very widely applied in China. It is estimated that around 300 million cameras using this facial recognition are installed around the country, and even there is also some evidence that some of this technology was programmed on this ethical background. So this was the way how Uyghurs minority was tracked, how their network and families were tracked by using this ethnical-based facial recognition technologies within the country. So we see this state control massive apparatus, which, as I mentioned, collects that data without any rules, without any privacy rules in place. And what is also very important about the technology itself, that the main meat for artificial intelligence is data. And for example, in Western countries, because of the existing regulation, there are certain limits to access that. For China, it has around 1.4 billion people that can be followed, and this data can be generated from. So this is also puts China and its companies in a very upfront and advanced position to be a leader of this technology development. And recent data in late years shows that China is surpassing the US in terms of amount of research conducted in financing startups, financing those technologies. And this is, of course, important not domestically, not the case, not only the case as a domestic example, but also about this influence abroad that China is also spreading, because we have already seen this these efforts to build a digital Silk Road, which was mainly based on helping other countries to build the technological digital infrastructure in different countries. There are also already records that quite a number of those technologies based on surveillance and facial recognition was sold to different countries around the globe, to Ethiopia, Ecuador, South Africa, Bolivia, Malaysia, Egypt, just to name it. So, of course, this is not only about how state governs the technology or how applies that technology to control or interact with its own people, its own inhabitants, but it's also like creating dependency and increasing influence around the globe. And because this advancement and possibly even bigger future advancement allows that to do, probably we will see more and more exports of those technologies, probably together with certain practices around the globe, and especially in those countries which tend to be not that much democratic as we would expect. So yeah, this kind of a new high-tech regime based on this rule-less and state control mechanism. Thank you.
Justinas, thank you very much. It's like you only strengthened Lina's issues that he raised: values, technologies, how that match, and then democracy as a regime, which and autocracy, for what purpose and how the technologies are employed. Florian, question to you: what's new about fake news? Fake news and disinformation, or fake news just as fake news? And what's new about fake news from Russia and meanwhile from China? Is it a new Cold War target and element to destabilize the West?
Thank you very much, Archu. The point is definitely yes. It is a new tool. This is also linked what was just said before from Justinas, that it's actually a new target, very effective. The phenomenon of fake news is not new. There was 1835, the great hoax that human beings are living on the moon, and we have a long history of fake news. Very interesting points, but we have a spread of fake news, and we were a bit too naive to observe that. In Germany, for example, was a very big shock, the Lisa case, when basically it was said that a young Russian-German girl was raped from a refugee, 2016. And this was a bit the wake-up call to do more on this topic. And of course, Brexit was also kind of a consequence out of fake news, and not by accidentally, there's a very interesting study from the House of Commons, which is really very valuable because they are dealing with the fake news topic. And just last week I got a call to give my expert opinion from the AfD. It was 6 o'clock in the evening. I got it on the Estonian phone. I have a German phone, Estonian phone. Not many people have my Estonian phone number. And 6 o'clock, and then it was in French. And then a French journalist asked me about my opinion about the COVID-19 demonstrations in Germany and the arguments of the demonstrators. And as I said, not many people have my Estonian phone number. And then I said, yeah, certainly I could do it, but from where you're coming from? And then he said, I'm coming from Russia Today, France, because they just opened up a studio. And then I said, thank you very much, I'm not doing that. And then he said, can you recommend me anybody further? Please write me. And I said, I asked it also, what is it about? Yeah, it's news for the next morning, 7 o'clock. And this is really shocking. And I never would do that, but you see also the linkage between the spread of fake news, that Russia Today, Sputnik, are in the Google News. We saw that very clearly, as I just said, in the refugee crisis 2015, 2016. Now they opened up a studio in France. Maybe what already said, that maybe the next president will be Marine Le Pen. And it goes further and further, and there is not so much resistance. And what we also observed, you know it, of course, but there is a close connection between the radical right and these channels, Russia Today and Sputnik. So very often the experts are from the radical right. And this is also very, very clearly proved from AfD and so on. And these are basically the experts, and even also from the left in Germany, from the post-communist party. And this goes further and further. And there's also from the German Social Democrats a big lobby for that. As we all know, our former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder is a big lobbyist now for all this Russian stuff. And it goes further and further. And Russia Today, Sputnik, they have their offices in Berlin. They are spreading around the fake news, and we have to take that seriously. And the other thing is, we have now some cases that German parliamentarians worked for Azerbaijan. This is maybe another topic. Got a lot of money for that. And China is not on the list yet with the fake news. But as already said, because of their digital strategies, there are also already the first academic books about that. It goes also in this Russian line. And we shouldn't be so naive as we were with Russia and the spread of the fake news from St. Petersburg.
Florian, thank you very much. Really putting the familiar topic as fake news is again on the top of the agenda. And you rightfully mentioned that there's no much of resilience within societies. It still surprises that Russia Today or Sputnik or similar outlets are treated, qualified as media and enjoys privileges of media. So that's also a question for our societies. And then new outlets, new platforms come in. And the questions or challenges are open to our societies, and they remain like this. Valerius, you have been teaching officers of insurgents and counterinsurgency. What are the indicators showing that the strategy of chaos has been applied to the society? Can you describe key features of the current influence operations or strategies of chaos, how it looks like?
Before my appointment to the Baltic Defense College as an instructor for special and information operations, I was deployed 2 times. In Afghanistan, I was a Special Forces Squadron Commander. In Iraq, I was military advisor. Both times, I was senior national representative. And as soon as I came to the Baltic Defense College, it was new idea, new trend. It was created model for insurgency and counterinsurgency, and I was assigned as a project officer because of my appropriate practical experience. But when you are teaching operational level, practical experience is not enough. Then I realized that I am short of theoretical framework, because before you do something, you have to know what it is. And back then, Allied Joint Publication 344, counterinsurgency, was not available for me yet. It was ratified probably 6 years later. And I was looking for a literature. And I have read Marx, Trotsky, Lenin, Verkhovsky, Evgeny Messner, and so on. And actually, I realized that actually insurgency is very much close to the revolution. And if Lenin describes that revolution is impossible without a revolutionary situation, which is when the bottom don't want to and the top cannot to live in the old ways, then you understand that it's a public-centric. Later on, when Allied Joint Publication Counterinsurgency was ratified, there were put preconditions for insurgency, 3 preconditions for insurgency. 1, vulnerable population. 2, lack of governmental control. 3, leadership available for direction. And then you kind of getting back that actually if a population feels itself vulnerable, so let's say if we are looking at a definition of insurgency, the purpose of insurgency is political change, but it's achieved by persuading or coercing the population through the use of violence and subversion. And the key word here is subversion, undermining morale, loyalty, reliability of the people. And it must be reason. Then get back to the Marx, and Marx says, reason has always existed, not always in a reasonable form. So there is always or are problems, but media can make it from the minor issue to the huge. So escalation. So getting back to the kind of whatever level of chaos or so on. If we are talking about those warfares, regular, irregular, conventional, unconventional, symmetric, asymmetric, traditional, we used to think that traditional warfare is symmetric, regular, conventional. And we were thinking that the irregular is antonym for regular. No, it's not. It's a different term. As well as asymmetric is not antonym for the symmetric, and conventional and unconventional are just totally different concepts. So, but what is unconventional warfare? Definition was changed, but I like a previous one, when unconventional warfare means that using of local inhabitant and resources for the political, economical, or military objectives. So, and this kind of, let's say, unconventional using of local resources very often is covered and clandestine. So you cannot see the operation, or you cannot detect the sponsor of the operation. Or a sponsor or organizer can deny it by plausible denial. So, and when we're looking at this kind of moving towards the chaos, Verkhovsky actually described pretty clearly. It's a Tsarist officer which was working for the Bolsheviks, and actually his doctrine was successfully applied in Georgia and failed in Estonia in 1924, that actually you have to create dissatisfaction. You have to kind of provoke a violence, so subversion goes to the violence, and then somebody asking for help, and the peacekeepers coming in and fixing everything. So, and when we're reading today doctrine of Russian Federation, we actually can see this between lines. I have mentioned Evgeny Messner. It was a white officer who was fighting Bolsheviks during civil wars, then he was fighting Soviets during World War II. Then he was teaching all over the world, and he wrote a book, «Что такое мятеж, война и как ее победить?» So, мятеж, война, it's kind of mutiny war, because term insurgency was not there. So Russians translated it and published in 2005 and called it like a, жемчужина русской военной мысли. So basically, and then I am finding in this book a chapter on that every officer will find himself one day in a situation when he will be leading irregular unit, and then he would be forced to undermine a principles of morale. So getting back again to Wagner's Ten Vatniks. So, and it is written a long time ago. So the indicators actually is disconnect within society and dissatisfaction. When we are deployed somewhere, we actually have a special chart, like an analysis of root grievances and so on, so on. Actually, we have to watch ourselves. So who is not happy and why? Because sometimes reason is just perceived. The problem is minor, but escalation can done it. So talking context of COVID, I would not overestimate COVID as such, because chaos is not operation. Chaos is campaign. When there is sequence or conflict of operations, or if we're talking about operational designs, and COVID can be just one operational line, you can find more operational lines, and it can be executed simultaneously, where some decisive conditions can be on a few lines at the same time. And our region, Baltic Sea region, we're actually the only 3 countries from, let's call, close abroad, ближнее зарубежье, which are members of NATO. It's a pretty much headache for the imperialistic revanchists. And we were extremely happy in 1993 when, on the 31st of August, occupying force went back. And for a couple of years, we didn't feel anything. But then in 95, we actually started to talk that actually the red ones trying to keep a seat warm. So it was first indicated that something is happening. And then later we were talking with the guys, why we felt it in 1995? Because we started to participate in international operations in 1995. So our Western direction was, in the military context, was clearly realized and perceived as a threat. As I said before, безопасность is a different word in the Russian language than security. So look in the mirror, think how do you feel, think how you are feeling like this, and probably problem just doesn't exist. Thank you.
Linas, to follow on what Valerius said, from the Western perspective, autocratic regimes usually behave offensive. That's the way we perceive, especially when talking about information operations, fake news, disinformation. And it might look that the democracies are losing against the autocratic regimes. Could you elaborate more on this perspective? Does the authoritarian regime have a competitive advantage against the democratic regime at any point, at any situation? Thank you.
Certainly. I think that democracies tend to underestimate themselves and to be extremely self-critical. So that's why it might seem that democracies are losing, that democracies are weaker, that democracies are incapable of tackling the most pressing issues. And just remember what we've had a year ago, on March or April 2020, when the pandemic struck us all. There was a debate on whether democracies are less capable of tackling the issue in comparison to autocratic regimes. And there were some data showing, obviously, that some results might be better in non-democratic countries. But that didn't prove to be a lasting statistic or a lasting result of a pandemic. We have mixed results in democratic and non-democratic countries, and the political system is just only one feature that distinguishes countries from one another in how they tackle the issue of the pandemic. There is no reason to say that, well, autocracies prove to be rapid in their decision making or prove to be capable of doing everything necessary to solve the issue of the pandemic in a better way than democracies. So that's one. The democracies are messy, clumsy, and self-critical, while autocracies seem to be, like a person in a shining armor who has all the capabilities in his or her hands. But that does not prove to be a lasting experience, because as we've noticed recently in Belarus, even an extremely stable, seemingly extremely stable regime can collapse basically in the eyes of its own population in the matter of a couple of weeks or a couple of days. And even though Lukashenko is still in power, I think we all understand that he is not the leader of a country that he was just a couple of years ago through an autocratic system. We've seen such examples before, and protests in Russia always put this as a discussion also in terms of how effective the Russian system is and how rapidly it could just collapse if some things go in a different direction. So I think that's what we will always see. I mean that democracies will be self-critical while autocracies will seem to be extremely effective and stable. But if you look at the longer trend, if you look at the longer term of analysis, you could notice that democracies seem to be the only ones that are capable of ensuring sustainability. And last but not least, let's celebrate the fact that for the first time in the history of our planet, after the Cold War, we've had more and still have more democratic regimes than autocratic ones. So it's a very new phenomenon. I think we tend to take it as granted that it's the normal world that we should live in, but that's not necessarily the case. Usually we've had more autocratic regimes, however different they be from one another than democracies, and that changed when the Cold War ended. That doesn't mean we shouldn't notice negative trends such as democracies and weakening of democracies even in continents of Europe or North America at some parts of their histories, but also let's not overlook the positive aspects.
Linas, thank you very much. You softly and in a very argumented way moved our discussion to the last point or last round of that there's what should be done and what are the and how Western powers should stand against authoritarian regimes. So actually you've already showed, indicated the tendencies, quite optimistic ones. I would love to go back to Justinas and ask how... sorry, Emilia, you were suggesting that somebody was raising hand. I couldn't. Florian. Florian, you want to step in? Please do that.
Sorry, I don't want to be impolite, but
please be.
You can continue. Okay, because it was very, very interesting statement what Linas just made. I'm a bit more pessimistic. Because when you see Viktor Orban's speech in 2014, and he's praising the illiberal state, and that basically the Western model is out, and we should basically focus more on the Asian models, China, Singapore, then we see a bit the decline of the European idea, and we saw basically the decline of European solidarity. I mentioned that already before. Renationalization, welcome refugee versus the policy in many other countries, and that's why I'm a bit more negative. And I would step in this. That I would say that I'm not so positive, because we are more dealing now business model approaches, the entrepreneurship model of politics, and this is changing our political landscape very much, in my view. Thank you very much.
Florian, thanks for stepping in. And if I may immediately jumping on this opportunity, I will go around the last round of questions. And before we take the questions from the audience, you will be the last that will give us a kind of finishing accent to this discussion. Just following your thoughts and this constructive criticism of the situation. And Justinas, I'm back to you. And want to come back to the digitalization digitalization and autocratic regimes' digitalization process. Are there any pro-democratic advantages? How to mitigate possible risks coming from the authoritarian regimes when we talk about technologies, about artificial intellect, etc.
Yes, thanks for the question. Yeah, I somehow focused quite a lot on especially authoritarian regimes and what's happening there. But of course, Western countries are not standing behind. They are also forming their own agenda. And of course, there is no easy answer in this case, but probably what is the way, as we discussed, authoritarian regimes tend to use the state control, rule-less approach, massive surveillance. So I think what is the way for democratic countries, pro-democratic countries, is to create a bit contrasting or different approach, which could be based on defining concrete rules, ensuring respect to fundamental human rights, ensuring respect to privacy, to promote this multi-stakeholder approach that it's not only controlled by the state, but different stakeholders are involved. For example, companies who are developing the technology, academia, NGOs, because there is this famous say that technologies are neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. So we can already see some reports that there is an issue of bias artificial intelligence, especially towards people of color. There is some kind of a risk of discrimination. So I think for democratic countries, if they move forward with pro-fundamental rights, pro-human rights approach to artificial intelligence, it is very important to be open about those challenges or risks that the technologies within the Western world can bring. And already we can see some actions. A few organizations have already announced their concepts, for example, OECD, OSCE, the Council of Europe, asking for ethical artificial intelligence and ethical development and application of this technology. The European Union is also formulating its code. That we can already find quite a number of different strategic documents saying that artificial intelligence should be pro-human rights. It must be ethical, trustworthy, human-centric technology. And as far as I know, the Commission is planning to release its legislative proposals by the end of April. So, of course, we will have a chance to see what's in the mind of creating this rules-based artificial intelligence regime within the EU. Of course, I just guess that negotiations will not be easy, but hopefully the EU member states will find the way to agree on that, and it won't install any fragmentation. And what would I also expect personally, that reading especially those strategic documents that are released now, though they stress the importance of human rights, ethics, protection of citizens, of their privacy, it very much focuses on economic and social affairs. And I would really like to see broad evaluation of strategic or geopolitical, how to call it, approach towards that, because it looks like risks are understood. There are efforts to name those risks, but I think some kind of strategic approach towards that, it is important, because we probably need all member states to be on board. So this will be a very interesting process to follow how these discussions will continue within the EU and, of course, in other countries and organizations as well.
Justinas, thanks. Still, it's optimistic. Risks understood and strategies. Also, there's a need of strategy and strategic approach. There's also a good understanding. Linus, I want to come back to your one of your remarks, saying when discussing the democratic and autocratic regimes, USA, China, or USA, Russia confrontation, you mentioned Europe. You said about Europe is going to find its own way. Do we talk about new formats of regional cooperation after in the post-COVID world? Could you elaborate what are the choices for Europe, or what choices Europe has, and what is Europe? The EU, Council of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I very much share concerns by Florian. Maybe we could be more optimistic or less optimistic, but I think the concerns are the same ones. So hopefully the result will be better rather than the worse one, but there are multiple challenges to tackle for sure. And with regards to your question, I think we have quite enough formats actually, and internal discussions in EU currently take place on multiple issues on how to develop the project that we have, the European Union. It could become a stronger foreign policy actor, a stronger actor in defense policy, maybe strategically autonomous organization or a group of countries. So there are multiple concepts that could be implemented, but in practice, of course, most of them face the same political issues or the same political dilemmas, whether we could really have a common approach on issues such as Russia, issues such as China, so certain aspects of these bilateral or trilateral or international relations. It doesn't really matter whether we have one format or another. The dilemmas remain the same, and we see that countries still tend to think from their national point of view when they discuss foreign policy or defense policy issues, with certain levels of cooperation, of course, in NATO and also the EU level. So I think it's not really necessary to look at something new. We should really work on those platforms that we already have and make the right decisions on how to develop them further. Because the idea on regional cooperation is good, but that shouldn't go against some broader continental initiatives. And we've seen some examples of regional formats such as 17+1, which Lithuania, seemingly the new government thinks is a way of avoiding having a common EU approach on China by putting emphasis on regional cooperation. And I think there are arguments to support this because when you focus on regional, you forget the continental, and the overemphasis on that could be a distraction. On the other hand, 3Cs initiative, obviously supported by the US, I think goes very much in the same direction as multiple initiatives by the EU to solve the issues related to infrastructure, energy, and etc. So that could be a very promising initiative that enables new rooms for engagement.
Thanks. Linus, we're talking about possibility of alliances. Cohesion of alliances is very important. Valerius, question to you. How Western powers should bear against the authoritarian regimes? Because advantages usually applying the chaos strategies, taking advantages of weaknesses, weak spots in alliances and partnerships. Your insights on that?
Actually, thank you for the question, but you partly already answered it. Because divide and conquer concept is it's much older than me. But so when I was reading Karl von Clausewitz, there is a concept of center of gravity. When we're talking about center of gravity, it depends on critical capability, critical requirements, and critical vulnerabilities. So critical vulnerabilities are the first things which are going to be exploited to affect critical requirements in the center of gravity. And the concept of civis pacem parabellum from the authoritarian regimes, actually I don't speak Chinese, I would say authoritarian regime, singular, sorry. So I have read a paper recently, and it was reformulated civis pacem parabellum and sounded like Хочешь мира, воюй. So it means if you want to peace, fight now. And I really like the name of the panel, how the authoritarian regime fights, because they do openly say we do fight. So the answer is we have to prevent split of the society, split between societies, keep strong alliances, and identify the threats early, because our adversary or peacetime competitor, he is permanently on social reconnaissance and social intelligence, because the objective as a center of gravity is a population, and again, center of gravity by Karl von Clausewitz in this context is a personality of leaders and a public opinion. So public opinion is important. And it was in the previous panel said that actually the society, it's kind of want to be defended. Yes, where it is another thing, kind of self-defense. Why societies don't think that somebody have to do it for them? Their targets have a right for self-defense. And we don't have to shoot ourselves in the leg. Actually, opponent would like that we would do it twice in both legs. But comprehension of the environment and actually comprehensive responses to the hybrid threats, that have to be a permanent feature. And in the previous panel, it was said that education, definitely. We have to start from education, how to detect lie, how to understand the threat, how to prevent a danger from becoming threat. And then, let's say, it's not quickly, but it will be opponents of this education, because the other side don't want us to be clever. And because I'm a chairman of Military Terminology Committee, sometimes we have to speak 3 or 4 languages to understand what the term means. And then we sometimes using synonyms and antonyms to understand what we are talking about. So antonym for education possibly would be stupidification. That's exactly what we have to avoid. Don't rush, think, evaluate. And alliances and societies, despite the differences, whatever languages we speak. Because I have a friend of mine who is joking, he's saying, I'm a Polish nationalist. And I'm saying, both of us Lithuanian. Because we do live here. So it is a joke now, but we are really friends, and actually those national differences really makes us united under the flag of this state. So, and if we would find more unifying factors and criteria than dividings, we would move in the right direction. Thank you.
Valerius, thank you very much. The time is running. I know that one of our panelists, Linas Kojala, will have to join another discussion, another online event. Thank you very much, Linas. Stay as long as you can, and if not, then we are looking for the other opportunities, meeting with you online or live. And to finish with, I want to come back to Florian. I appreciate, Florian, I appreciate your points, because all the panel actually serves a good, we are alarmists in this panel. We voice concern and also point to these issues that should be taken very seriously. I will ask you to finish with you were the first to start our panel, so to finish with your insights. What can be done against the chaos in political communication, which is already a security concern. And at the same time, I want to voice the question from Vitaly, saying that in previous panel, it was suggested to have an open academic discussion. What can West do with media, like Russia Today, RT, Sputnik, etc., and we don't know even Chinese media outlets. So what can West do with the media technologies which are state-sponsored as weapons? Those two questions, I think they are very much in line.
Archu. It's a very big task. I would start with a totally different aspect. I grew up in party politics in Germany, and I learned in my first seminar that it's important to be active and a member of a political party. From my experience in Estonia since 2014, I see that it's a damage. So everybody has to be neutral, and it's actually a disadvantage for your political career and even your personal life. So we have to tackle this, that we have to increase the activism in party politics. It cannot be that the party politics is just based on career and on political elites. I made once a political course in the University at Tartu, and then they asked it about why you should be involved in party politics. And then the first answer was, yeah, I want to make career. And now we see also in German politics, mass deals, the deals with Azerbaijan, and we cannot strengthen our liberal democracies if we are not supporting the activism in party politics. And this is the biggest weakness, what we are facing within. And we can have very nice discussions, but this is actually the basic. And also when I applied for state jobs in Estonia, then it was said I shouldn't say that I'm a political scientist, because politics is bad. If you're not tackling the basics, then we cannot tackle any kind of security challenges. This is my first remark. Second remark is, yes, we have to tackle the alternative media. And there's a quality decline from the established media. We had in Germany the fake news within the Spiegel, our best newspaper, the Relotius affair. I saw this in Estonia, that the alternative media portal called Objektiv was taken over one by one to the biggest newspaper, Postimees. So we have to strengthen basically the quality of the established newspaper, not just following the click logic. Third point is that we have to say it's important to deal with politics. If we have no political debates, what I see in Estonia, for example, where I'm living since 2014, we cannot strengthen our liberal democracies. So we have to deal with the basics. What is democracy? What is the dictatorship? What are the factors? And why it's important to bring this also to our private lives. Answer the second question about the Russia Today, the media. Yes, we know already that Facebook and so on are stronger than the states. So basically, we have to ask the United States companies to ban the fake news. This is an ongoing process since 3-4 years. And we don't have any other options. We just have to warn about. I see for my students, they're citing Russia Today, Sputnik. They're citing the conspiracy theorists. Again, it's political education with matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florian. And on that note, we will wrap it up. Thank you to our 4 panelists, Dr. Florian Hartleb, Linas Kojala, Justinas Linkevičius, and Lieutenant Colonel Valerijus Šerelis. And big thanks to our virtual audience. See you next time.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you to Mrs. Dalia Bankauskaitė for moderating the last panel. Because we have a program where we go directly into the third panel, we will not have a break right now. We'll have a short break after this last one, this third one, I'm sorry. The next panel is perhaps the most technical of all 4 panels, so I will not have any introductory commentaries. Therefore, it is my honor to present the moderator, who will do his own introduction of the panel itself. Dr. Timo Hellenberg is CEO and founder of Hellenberg International, a consultancy which assists public and private entities in critical infrastructure protection, crisis management-related projects. He served as special advisor on EU and foreign affairs to 2 prime ministers of Finland. He has 25 years of experience as an academic and crisis management researcher, which also includes being an advisor to the United Nations. He also has a long academic record as a lecturer about international relations and political science at University of Helsinki and University of Tampere. The topic is interoperability of mines as key principle in hybrid defense. And that's quite a bit, that's a heavy topic. So, Dr. Hellenberg, please, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, it's a great privilege to be here today in a very high-level forum. Coming from Finland, Helsinki, Baltic Sea region is always and will remain our security priority in many respects. And cooperation with Lithuania has very long traditions, both at the political strategic level and tactical operational level. I would also like to thank Mr. Chairman and the organizers, particularly Lithuanian Defense Foundation and Lithuanian Parliament for organizing this event. Hybrid influencing and hybrid tactics have been in the toolbox of different aggressors as long as the human beings have been interacting with each other. So this is nothing new for us. During the Cold War era, the hybrid tactics was actually developed as a side tool for the traditional warfare influencing. We have also seen development within countries like Russia in the strategic debate, the Gibrinaya Voina, the development of the hybrid influencing as a tool to support the traditional battlefield mechanisms with the aim of destroying the political cohesion of the adversary from inside. Mr. Chairman, like we have heard today in previous panels, our modern democracies are today being challenged more than ever before. Not only because of the new type of hybrid warfare, but also because we are so interconnected. We are more vulnerable than ever before. It's our own responsibility to create sustained frontline resilience, societal resilience, to counter any kind of hybrid type of threats affecting our societies. I would like to move on with our panel. The topic today, interoperability of minds as key principle in hybrid defense. We aim to focus on two main things. First of all, how to enhance the effectiveness, the impact of the hybrid defense in our society, and on the other, how we can enforce the efficiency, more outcome with less resources of interoperability and particularly the comprehensiveness of hybrid defenses. It is my great pleasure to introduce one of our first speakers, Mr. Michael Malm. He is a senior advisor at the Swedish Armed Forces. He has very long career in different positions. He's currently working at the Department of Total Defense. Mr. Malm has several posts in different departments. He has served at the Swedish Air Force, Swedish Defense University, Swedish Defense Research Agency, and Baltic Defense College. He's a very central person also here in Lithuania. He has been active participant at the Vilnius Security Forum, and he's a constant supporter of the Lithuanian Defense Foundation. So, Michael Malm, it's a great privilege to invite you as the first speaker of the panel. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Timo. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Lovely.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, we can take the next slide. Thank you very much, Timo, for a very kind introduction. It sounds that I'm extremely old, and perhaps I am. I just want to hide it as best as I can. I will talk about cultural and cognitive interoperability, because interoperability as such is always important if you are going to cooperate as an organization or as a nation with other organizations or nations. And I think that many times we focus on technical interoperability. What kind of fuels are we going to have? Or doctrinal interoperability, or perhaps language interoperability. But I think that we need to focus more perhaps on cultural and cognitive interoperability. Because I don't think that we are as interoperable as we could be, should be, or need to be. And I will try to prove my case. Next slide, please. I like this map very much. It changes over time, and this is the last version of this cultural map. And as you can see, there is a distance between, let's say, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, and on this slide, Lithuania and Estonia. There is also a distance between Norway and Sweden and Denmark, and you can see that if you live, and you can feel it if you live in those countries. But I will focus more now on Sweden, Norway, and Denmark as one group versus on this map Estonia and Lithuania. And there is a gap between our countries. And there is a sort of incompatibility when it comes to the cultural and the cognitive aspects of our two countries. We are not as interoperable as we could, should, or need to be. One thing I just want to mention is that, as you can see, Sweden is on the extreme right. We seem to be an extreme country, and that is not really how people in Sweden view themselves. We are sort of the middle way. We try to stay in the middle. But as you can see on this slide, we are the extremists on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side, you can see the extremists are Egypt and Qatar. As I said, I really like this map because it focuses on that we need to think about the interoperability when it comes to culture and cognition. Next slide, please. You can say that culture, if you simplify it a little bit, that culture is how you have learned to think, feel, and act. And I think that the countries around the Baltic Sea, even if we are all the countries around the Baltic Sea, even if we are close neighbors, see the world very, very differently based on where we come from and where we sit. I remember when I worked at the Baltic Defense College in 2014, and the Crimea was the topic of the day. Everybody talked about it, everybody argued about it, everybody was thinking about it. And also the public debate in Estonia was centered around what was going on in Ukraine. And then I took the airplane back to Stockholm and landed at Arlanda, and it was like coming to another planet. Nobody was talking about what was going on in Ukraine or Crimea. And if you mentioned it, well, where is Ukraine? Can you point it to me on a map? So then I realized that we are living in two different universes, and it was very interesting to travel back and forth. And we can take the next slide. As you can see on this slide, something happened in 2014. There was a change in the public debate in Sweden. Russia was more on the agenda, both publicly and both in the media. But now, as you can see, that slightly drops, and you can see what really worries Swedes nowadays. And I think this slide reflects very well what's on the public in the public debate today and what's on people's mind today. And therefore, I sense when I travel that we are not talking about the same thing. When we talk about threats, when we talk about dangers, I like the concept that was mentioned before, dangers versus threats. So I don't think really we are as interoperable, as I said, as we should or need to be. We can take the next slide. I would keep my presentation quite short. Then I will be open to answer any questions or take part in the discussion. To me, basically it boils down to a very simple question, and that is, what are we really willing to die for? And are we in our neighborhood willing to die for the same thing? I mean, do we have the same interests? Linas were discussing values and interests. Do we have the same perception of our interests and values? And do we have the same threat perception? Do we see the threat the same way? Do we see the dangers in the same way? And when I say we, I mean the countries around the Baltic Sea. So I think it's important to reflect what we are willing to sacrifice in order to defend our interests and our values. And what are we ready to sacrifice to deal with the threat? And we need to have a sort of discussion about that, and we have to have a sort of an honest discussion about that, because sometimes I hear that we are saying the same words, but I don't think we mean the same thing. Basically, that my end reflection is that we need to work more so that we are more interoperable of the mind. Otherwise, an opponent will use this lack of interoperability against us. Thank you very much.
Yes, Michael, please continue.
I was finished.
Thank you very much. I liked a lot for your presentation, and particularly thank you for giving us food for thought for the panel discussion later on. Definitely, what are we willing to die for? It's a question to bear in mind, and it is my privilege to introduce our next speaker, Rasmus Hindrén. Mr. Hindrén is the head of the international relations at the European Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats. Previously, Mr. Hindrén served at the Ministry of Defense of Finland, where he was deputy head of unit for defense cooperation. He has worked at the Ministry of Defense since 2008 in several positions, dealing with the multilateral and bilateral defense issues. And Mr. Hindrén, it's a great pleasure to have you with us today. So please, floor is yours.
Thank you, Timo, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the invitation. It's great to be in this panel, even if my name isn't Michael, but still. Let me also congratulate you on the topic of the whole conference. Of course, a topic with which we at the Center of Excellence work on a daily basis, but where a lot of work remains. So for this discussion, focusing on interoperability, my angle is interoperability in international cooperation in countering hybrid threats. How that both requires interoperability, but how that also leads to increased interoperability. And of course, interoperability as such is not the end goal, but more of a means to effective joint responses. Can I have the next slide, please? So first, let me say 2 words about the center. As I alluded to, we exist in this nexus of international cooperation and countering hybrid threats, and we are here to support our participating states and the EU and NATO, and of course Lithuania being a participating state. So great to be supporting our Lithuanian colleagues in this sense as well. So one of our tasks is to increase awareness and share best practices. We operate very much on a networking approach and try to foster that kind of networking among our stakeholders as well. And while most of the responsibilities for countering hybrid threats lie at the national level, our research and experiences tell us that very often taking the issues to the international level is highly recommendable. I don't want to dwell on the basic terminology too much, but let me just say quickly how we at the center understand hybridity. For us, hybrid activities are coordinated actions that target systemic vulnerabilities through a wide range of means. And these activities, they exploit the thresholds of detection and attribution, as well as the borders between war and peace, internal and external, public and private, civil, military, and so on. But now on interoperability, and I will, as I said, I will focus on the international aspects of it. So I'm stretching the topic a little bit, but I think it's still pertinent. I use the term broadly, not exactly in the same way as Mikael Malm was portraying it, but I think very much compatible with it, to cover 2 interrelated parts. First one is the technical interoperability, and the other one is what we call the political strategic interoperability. So the technical part forms a necessary basis, but it doesn't amount to much without this political strategic interoperability. And what I mean by strategic interoperability is the extent to which our threat perceptions and our strategies are aligned, and our readiness to share information with our partners, our ability to look for joint solutions, and to muster that kind of resolve that is required for any joint decision making. So, and this type of interoperability is built over the years, and it requires a lot of trust, and it requires certain institutional arrangements as well. Next slide, please. So there are several ways of approaching international cooperation in countering hybrid threats. One way is to separate the two aspects of resilience and responding to crises. And these are, of course, interrelated, but this helps us maybe to understand a bit better the different phases and ways of interacting between countries. And this is also in line with the concept of hybrid deterrence, which pretty much like the classical models of deterrence is also based on the twin pillars of deterrence by denial and deterrence by punishment. And on the left-hand side, that's of course referring more to the deterrence by denial aspects. So looking at the left side, it makes sense to exchange information, because a common situational awareness is a prerequisite for any effective joint responses. Sharing experiences, best practices is critical because of the nature of hybrid influencing attacks. They're relatively cheap to execute and hard to detect. So therefore they are commonly replicated across a number of countries. So the faster we can get the information from one country to another about the extent and type of attack, the better. And then the other countries can adapt their mechanisms, including intelligence gathering as necessary. And this also both of these feed into early warning capability. The better we understand the threat environment, the more we hear about our neighboring states' experiences, the easier it becomes to get early warning on gradually building crisis. Finally, also on the resilience side, capability development and doing that jointly is definitely a factor in increasing interoperability, as it is based on shared priorities and shared requirements. So then, talking about responses, coherent strategic communication is key. The message can be amplified if it's agreed in a broader international framework, whether it is in a regional minilateral format or whether it is in the EU or NATO, for instance. And the same goes for countermeasures. To give an obvious example, if it's decided to place sanctions against a hybrid aggressor, it's easy to calculate what is the most effective solution. Is it when a country of 5 million people sets those sanctions, or is it when a bloc of 500 million people sets those sanctions? So what does this kind of international response then entail? Next slide, please. So these are some of the main elements required for effective responses and effective deterrence as well. These are actually valid for the national level, but some are more pertinent perhaps to the international level. Capabilities to withstand and to counter the aggression are obviously required, and as underlined earlier, communication is key, both communicating to your own population and then communicating to the aggressor. Resolve, this is this is critical because of the nature of hybrid influencing. It's often this kind of slow burning thing and takes place mostly under the radar. So it's really hard to get a sense of urgency and the resolve needed for the effective responses. Agility, that is hard already in a national framework because we're talking about cross-governmental and cross-societal threats, but it's even harder when there's a need to coordinate the positions of 27 or 30 member states. This is why the mechanisms for decision-making and situational awareness should be built already before something happens, and exercised preferably. Attribution is usually a part of an effective response, and that can be amplified if it's done in an international format. Solidarity is another obvious one. If your neighbor's house is on fire, it perhaps is a good idea to help them because the next day it might be your house on fire. Unity is not just an abstract term here because unanimity is required for decision making both in the EU and NATO. Currently, there are some discussions on whether the unanimity rule could be waived in some cases. Looking purely from the perspective of the threat environment, that would be a good thing to explore. Coherence is related to how we understand the situation and how we understand the tools at our disposal. And there has to be this coherent, integrated approach, both to analyzing the situation and the decision making. And the toolbox should include lots of tools, not just hammers and not just megaphones. There has to be an ability to control escalation, and that's where the tools will come in handy. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide with a bit of focus on the EU. I'd say there are two takeaways here. First, the EU has the potential to be a comprehensive actor in countering hybrid threats. And second, it's not quite there yet. And one of the main reasons is that the EU institutions are operating on their own competencies, obviously, which makes a lot of sense, but it's not perhaps geared towards a crisis response, especially in a hybrid threat environment. And the same logic should apply here as at the national levels. It has to be an integrated approach. To try to compress this very complex issue a little bit, the key lies in combining the external and internal security aspects in the EU. Essentially, there's a need to figure out the level of ambition, then the tools and capabilities have to be there, and finally, the procedures for decision-making in situations which might call for horizontal or vertical escalation. Now, looking at the strategy side, there are good examples. The trick is to ensure the interoperability between these strategies, and I'm thinking of the box in the upper right-hand corner. So to ensure that this all forms a coherent whole. Looking at the tools, which is on the lower left-hand corner, this is a non-exhaustive list of initiatives that are taking place in the EU. And when we compare this list to the cluster of domains on the right, we can see that with the initiatives, a lot of these domains are being covered. And this is good news. But the trick is, again, to make sure that this forms a coherent, integrated whole, where the information flows from one domain to the other, where we can identify weak spots and gaps, and when something happens, that we can muster the response, and first of all, that we are aware of all the tools that are at our disposal. I'm going to end here. I didn't speak too much to NATO or EU-NATO cooperation. Let me just say that the need for EU-NATO cooperation is clear, and it's growing. And each organization has their advantages. It's just we should try to ensure that they would be used in a coherent manner in future crises. So with this, I thank you, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Rasmus. Strategic interoperability, resilience, strategic communication. I'm sure we will have plenty of questions for you, not least how to involve the private sector in this process. But it's a great pleasure to introduce our third speaker from the NATO. As we know, by the way, NATO has been supporting the Vilnius Security Forum, and our speaker, Mr. Michael Rühle, is head of the Hybrid Challenges and Energy Security section of the NATO. He belongs to the Emerging Security Challenges Division, the international stuff, and he has a very long career within the organization. He has been working also as head of the NATO Secretary General's Policy Planning Unit, and he is having several international positions. He has been Senior Fellow at the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and he has been also serving as a Senior Fellow at the CSIS in Washington. Mr. Rühle, it's a great pleasure to have you with us, and it's been privilege to work with you before this conference, and we certainly look forward to your contribution. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much. It's great to be in Vilnius, sort of, virtually. And I hope that we will soon have the chance to do this meeting or similar meetings in person again. Countering hybrid threats has moved to the top of the security agenda of many nations and many institutions. Rasmus just pointed that out. And this is hardly surprising because we see a rapid increase of, let's say, malign activities in the gray zone. And that makes finding effective responses a strategic necessity. And given the nature of these mostly non-military, non-kinetic, and sometimes non-attributable activities, countering them requires seamless cooperation between nations and institutions. The question, though, is, do all players really sing from the same song sheet? And I would say you just take a quick glance at the literature and you realize that they do not. Not only are there many definitions out there on hybrid, there is also a considerable lack of discipline in applying the term. For example, cyber and hybrid attacks are often used interchangeably. Terms like hybrid war are used as if the term war had no specific legal meaning anymore. And even smaller non-existential hybrid activities are said to be extremely dangerous. So how can we ensure that we have a common understanding of the threats and of the responses? I formulated what I call the 9 commandments on countering hybrid threats. I wanted to do 10, but my lawyer said for copyright reasons I should stick with 9. Intended to help us reaching a common understanding and hence chart a common course. And my first commandment would be, thou shalt be precise. Hybrid always means a combination of 2 or more tools or actions. So we should not use the term when we are just describing a series of cyber attacks, for example, or a single disinformation effort. Only when several tools are applied together is the word hybrid really appropriate. Rule of thumb, whenever an expert uses the term hybrid, but then only talks about cyber, he is not an expert. So calling everything we don't like hybrid is a semantic overstretch that only leads to confuse ourselves. My second commandment would be, thou shalt not generalize. For many analysts, and it's already been mentioned earlier in this conference, Ukraine 2014 was the kind of textbook example of contemporary hybrid approaches. But Ukraine was far more vulnerable to Russian activities than most other countries, leaving aside the fact that the ultimate push that got the Russians what they want was kinetic and not hybrid. So generalizing the Ukraine case into a template for future Russian hybrid activities elsewhere could be a self-deceiving exercise. Every hybrid case is a sui generis case, even when there may be parallels between some of them. The third commandment, thou shalt be actor-specific. That's a big thing that we're discussing at NATO all the time these days. It's very seductive to over-conceptualize hybrid threats. This makes for some impressive PowerPoint presentations sometimes, but real-world malign hybrid activities are being perpetrated by real state and non-state actors with real strategic interests. And as these actors and interests differ, so do their hybrid activities, and so must be our responses. No adversary has ever been defeated by PowerPoint slides or by banal quotes, be it Clausewitz or Sun Tzu, and I think they are banal. My fourth commandment, look at interest. Much of the current debate is a debate about tools. We're obsessed with tools, cyber, disinformation, election interference, and so on. But the overarching question must not be about the adversary's tools, but about the interests that lie behind the decision to initiate hybrid activities. Only when we know these interests can we respond effectively with measures that target these very interests. And Rasmus gave a couple of examples. Even better, if you know an opponent's interests, may allow us to find ways of accommodation in some cases that reduces the hybrid attacks or the chances for hybrid attacks in the first place. My fifth commandment, don't mirror image. In trying to find ways to deter hybrid campaigns, Western analysts often fall into the trap of mirror imaging. That's nothing new. For example, some believe that by consistently naming and shaming the hybrid perpetrator, you could deter that perpetrator from further interference, from continuing his bad stuff. That approach may work vis-a-vis most Western countries, because Western countries are mindful of their reputation and, of course, of their public opinion. Other countries, however, will simply deny that they are the culprit, and they will rely instead on the low likelihood that their culpability can ever be proven precisely. So, in short, what may deter the West does not necessarily deter others. And my sixth commandment, thou shalt covet your neighbor's experience. The exchange of best practices with like-minded countries is among the most important elements of fostering a common approach to hybrid threats. And that's why we in NATO are so fond of the COE in Helsinki, because it is a platform where this can be done. Australia's experience in dealing with Chinese influence campaigns can be as useful as Israel's experience in dealing with non-state actors or Ukraine's experience dealing with Russia. Not every national experience can be wholesale adopted by others. As Michael Malm said, countries are different, and certain means, let's say, adopting new laws will work in some countries and may not work in other countries. But over time, I think if we exchange best practices, what will happen is the emergence of a solid acquis on how best to counter malign activities. My seventh commandment, thou shalt become more resilient. I'm not saying anything new here. Deterrence is the centerpiece of a strategy to prevent military conflict. And it can also be applied to hybrid, as Rasmus said, but I think resilience is the key concept when dealing with hybrid threats. Resilience presumes that an attack will happen, and hence the stricken nation or alliance must be able to take the hit and bounce back. Resilience requires investments, a lot of investments in cyber defense, in the protection of critical energy infrastructure, public education, how to deal with fake news on social media, for example. It is a very unglamorous thing, but I think it's the most useful paradigm for coping with a world where interstate competition increasingly takes place in the gray area. My eighth commandment, thou shalt not be alarmist. The obsession with hybrid warfare has led to an alarmism among the Western strategic community that is unhelpful and I would argue even counterproductive. What gets lost in this nervous debate is the fact that most hybrid campaigns are a case of trial and error, and many of them fail. Hence, by hyping hybrid into a miracle strategy, for example, in the context of undermining the deterrent provided by NATO's enhanced forward presence in the Baltic states, the Western strategic community hands a hybrid aggressor like Russia a cheap victory. If we were less alarmist, I think we would do ourselves a favor. Ninth commandment, my last commandment, thou shalt not accept hybrid as the new normal. Largely due to technical developments such as cyber and social media, hybrid activities have become a constant feature of international relations. Yet there is no law of nature that would make this unpleasant situation inevitable or permanent. Most hybrid actors have a face and an address. They can be countered, they can be punished, they can be deterred, but they can also be engaged. So if the West stays united and learns how to get better at meeting threats in the gray area, it can blunt the hybrid weapon, even if it may never completely eradicate it. So if we stick by these 9 principles that I've been laying out here, we should be able to develop the human interoperability that will allow us to build a solid counter-hybrid toolbox. And we can talk about more in the Q's and A's. It will make the West as a whole more resilient, and it will raise the price for hybrid aggression. And once we have all done that, then we can relax, enjoy a hybrid refreshment. I go for gin and tonic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. This was a fantastic presentation, and what I would like to do right now is to give each one of you a short intervention to each other's presentations. I know we have some questions from the audience. Myself, I have some notes I would like to bring up, but I would like to ask Michael Malm to reflect to the other 2 presentations, and then after that Rasmus and Foron. So Michael Malm, please.
First of all, thank you very much. I was really impressed. I took notes as much as I could. One thing that I reflected on, and I'm not sure if I got it right, but overall, my sense is that we often is not so proactive as we could be. We tend to react more to what others are doing instead of being proactive doing what we want to do. I think that's at least the case of Sweden. The other thing that I reflect on is that, and I've said it a number of times earlier, that we are very preoccupied what Russia is doing. Russia, instead of saying what are the things that we want to achieve, what is important to us, and again that's part of the reactivity of our countries, and I don't know what you say about that, but that's a reflection on: are we too reactive, or do you think by these approaches we will become more proactive?
Thank you, Michael. And Rasmus, would you like to reflect?
Thank you. Yes, I liked both presentations very much, and just maybe to follow up on what Mikael said about the reactiveness, I would agree that there's too much focus on being reactive instead of proactive. But I think it sort of goes back to what I was saying about the need to have a clear, coherent strategy and to have the understanding of the toolbox and the capabilities in the toolbox. When you have those clarified, then it's easier perhaps to be proactive as well. And I think this applies to national levels and the international level as well. Thinking about what Michael Rühle said, I liked very much, and I'm very much in agreement with what he said. Maybe just to pick a couple of points there. Indeed, it's useful to be precise when using the terminology and when talking about these issues. But this is also related to the need, still the need that we have to conceptualize these issues. So over conceptualizing is a bad thing, shouldn't do it. but conceptualizing is critical to get that kind of common understanding, which we sometimes, unfortunately, still are lacking even after all these years. And on resilience, indeed, it's crucial, and there's a heavy focus on resilience. But it's also worth noting that it's a very blurry line between these various aspects of resilience and responses and what is there in between. Sometimes same capabilities can be utilized for resilience and defense purposes, and they can be used for countermeasures or offensive capabilities. So indeed, it's a very blurry line, and it's good to consider both of those sides. Yes, I think I'll perhaps stop there, and then we can come back later.
Thank you, Rasmus. And Michael Rühle, could you please reflect?
Yes, thank you. Trying to get these two presentations of my colleagues together, I think there is Michael Malm's point that countries are different and have different interests, also partially because they sit on different parts of the map, and therefore have different worries about invasions or what have you, is a very valid point. But the good thing is that, or the good thing or the bad thing, whatever, I think we all, no matter where we are in Europe, for example, whether you're in Sweden or in Lithuania, we are victims of various forms of malign hybrid activities. And so I think all our decision makers feel that there is something that needs to be done. And that's why I think a tool like and this brings me to Rasmus' point, a tool like a COE, especially this unique COE because it works for NATO and EU, is so attractive because it brings different countries together. It conceptualizes hybrid, yes, but up to a point, and it talks it works mostly, or it focuses mostly about concrete issues. What can we do in order to make sure that we are less, let's say, harassed by a hybrid activity? So I think the point by Michael Malm that things are that nations have different views doesn't necessarily have to stand in a way of getting together and finding common responses. And I made this point. One of the commandments was best practices exchange. I do not think, to give you a concrete example, we once had an academic at NATO talking about, from the Asia-Pacific region, talking about how China is going to, is kind of penetrating the academic landscape in certain places. And even if what he says was not 100%, let's say, transferable to Sweden, Germany, or Finland, there were a lot of interesting gems of information in there which help you to be more vigilant if something like this should happen in your own neighborhood. So different countries with different interests, but I think an overarching interest in finding solutions to a very intractable problem called hybrid.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I must say that somehow the discussion, what we had here today and also previously, when it comes to the hybrid threats, resembles me about the discussion we had 10 years ago when we started to launch the concept of critical infrastructure protection in Europe. The difficulty laid with the conceptualization. What is critical for one is not critical to the other. What is valid for the other is not necessarily central for the other actor. Somehow, summarizing, listening our excellent presentations, one question prevails in my mind, and that is the fact that if the other side, if the aggressor side, whether public or private, entities using comprehensive, robust methods against our free modern societies, unconventional of their nature, how can we respond coherently, effectively, efficiently to preserve our societies, and particularly at the cost of the interoperability? That is something which came to my mind. The other thing, of course, is should we find new incentives for public-private partnerships in the field of the hybrid defense to engage the minds and hearts against the influencing, external influencing? And are there some best practice models which we should take into account? For instance, in the aftermath of the 9/11 in the US, how the Homeland Security strategy was created in relatively short time period, and particularly how to engage the private actors through the incentives like taxation, social visibility, and government shortlisting to take part to the response side. These are the thoughts which came to my mind during these three presentations. We actually have one question from the audience, and this is to Mr. Michael Rühle. The question is here: hybrid threats can do as much damage as conventional threats. What should be done, adjusted the NATO Treaty Article 5 to address hybrid threats? So should the NATO Article 5 treaty be adjusted somehow to tackle the hybrid threats? So maybe you would like to address this question, Mr. Rühle.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I would be very cautious about making such statements like hybrid is just as dangerous as kinetic. I think it's still a huge difference. Hybrid is more fascinating somehow than kinetic, but I would be very cautious about this. The second point, NATO has already declared that Article 5 can be triggered by a hybrid attack. We have never specified what that means. We have said the same, by the way, on cyber. We have never specified what that means, because if you specify it, you tell an aggressor where your threshold lies, and that's exactly what you don't want him to know. So there has already been a change by putting hybrid into the basket, let's say, of traditional Article 5 triggers. In terms of adaptation, I think that's something you will never put in a treaty. The Washington Treaty is brilliant as it is, and it should be interpreted according to the changing times, but it should never be touched. The wording should never be touched. So when you look at the way that NATO is indeed responding to all of this by broadening our counter-hybrid toolbox, by for example, coming up with the counter-hybrid support team concept, by working, as we do right now, on comprehensive civil-military options, by doing more exercises so that the hybrid logic is kind of trickling down into the NATO system, both the civilian and the military system. We are already in the middle of an adjustment process. But the fundamental problem that is inherent in the question, I think will not go away so easily. When does an organization collectively respond to a hybrid aggression? If the hybrid aggression is only against one or two nations and it doesn't create mass casualties, let's say, it will be very difficult to go to NATO and say, okay, guys, now we have to do something together. We have to send a very strong signal. What should that signal be? So we need to work on this, I think, quite a little bit longer, because it is simply not as clear. The whole point about hybrid is that it's not as clear cut as 1,000 tanks crossing your border. So we have to find more. We have to learn how to work in the gray area. And I think so far we are still at the beginning.
Thank you very much. And I would like to address Michael Malm about the concept of the total defense when it comes to the hybrid defense. So I recall 10 years ago when we were speaking about the Nordic model, the comprehensive defense, comprehensive responses, and total defense system. It was quite easy to confront the comments that this system is out of date and old-fashioned, and I'm sure you remember this debate at that time. But how would you describe the role of the total defense, the let it be Nordic model, when it comes to the hybrid multi-influencing, and how useful is this concept for that purpose? I'm recalling the public-private partnership, basically. So how can we mobilize the rest of the society, not only the public sector, to this response? Please.
As you probably know, that we are in a development phase right now, setting up a modern total defense, and there are a number of aspects that we have to rethink, and some of the aspects of the old system that still works. And one of the aspects of the old system that works actually is what we call the principle of responsibility. And that's a principle that we have been using since, well, the 50s, probably, which means that the government agency, if a government agency is responsible for the transportation sector in peacetime, it's also responsible for the transportation sector in wartime. And we have a combination of this principle of responsibility with a very decentralized system means that any public agency or any agency, government agency, even if it's on the local level, regional level, or the national level, can push the bottom and say something is happening. Now this system has to start to react. And during the total defense exercise that we conducted last year, and some parts even this year, we practiced just that. How is the decision-making and the problem-solving process? How are we going to cope with hybrid threats or the gray zone or whatever we call it? And that was one of the main purposes of that exercise. And I think part of what we have learned is, of course, as you said, Timo, the importance of the private sector. In the 50s, the government agencies had their own resources, and like the rest of Europe, nowadays everything is outsourced, and all resources lie in the private sector. What we have learned now, when we are talking very much and trying to integrate the private sector as much as possible, is that many of the companies are true global companies, like Saab, like Ericsson, etc., etc., and they have a lot of experience from areas where they are confronted with hybrid threats, perhaps even more than the armed forces. Because they are in combat zones, they are working in areas contested with hybrid threats, cyber attacks, you name it. So basically what we can do, if we are smart, we can learn from them and at the same time integrate them into our system. So we are now, in the last bill, in the last defense bill, it says that we are going to have on the national level a private board with representatives from the private sector talking directly at the government level, just to make sure that the private sector are integrated into the total defense.
Thank you, Michael, and I would like you to stay with us. And Rasmus, could you also reflect to this issue of how to find the encouragement and incentives for the private sector to be involved, but also I would like you to reflect a little bit to this external and internal, the dividends of external and internal threat. I think this is one of the challenges, because in many countries, for instance in Finland, we still have the system which is divided to the internal and external security when it comes to the sectoral response system. So how does it look for you when you look the current situation, and particularly should we look at the best practice models like the one I mentioned with the US government? Please.
Yes, thank you. First of all, on the public-private side, You mentioned incentives. That's one thing, and the other thing might be to look at the interests. So basically share the threat picture with them and to figure out where the common interests lie. And of course, we have some good examples of that in the Finnish comprehensive security model. And this is sometimes also we can consider this in the context of the term security of supply. So it's a broadly, if you understand it broadly, it covers the cooperation with the industry. It covers critical technologies, but it also covers the supply chains. And this is, of course, the thing, when we're discussing public-private partnerships, we need to indeed look at the global interrelationships and the supply chains, as Mikael was alluding to as well. But besides the Finnish examples, there are other good examples. And for instance, in the US, there's a lot of focus on this topic, also on the defense side, where there's a need to cooperate better with the Silicon Valley companies. And that requires a little bit different logic from the previous types of strategic partnerships with the big industrial companies. So there's this kind of reflection ongoing, and I think there's a lot to learn from that as well. On the external-internal divide, I think our mechanisms and structures indeed are divided to quite a big extent into internal and external. The problem is that the threats are not divided into internal and external threats. So if we cannot change the types of threats, we need to be able to adapt our approaches and structures to at least some extent. So and there are of course work being done in a lot of places, and the UK integrated review was perhaps an example of this process and this direction. But definitely more needs to be done, both at the national levels again and at the international level.
Thank you, Rasmus. This was very, very informative, and I personally agree that if the threats are not going to change, then we probably should change our systems and to adapt. And luckily, we have some best practice models like in Denmark and Netherlands, where the system has been reflecting to the changing of the environment. Mr. Michael Rühle, I would like you to kindly to reflect also to this issue of how to encourage the public-private partnerships, taking into account that it's often the private sector which is targeted and suffering of the
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
It's the private sector that's targeted, and it's also the private sector that produces most of the stuff that we need to defend ourselves. So there are very good arguments for sticking close together. I think the first experience came from the cyber colleagues who worked very closely with some software companies. The problem is, of course, when you have a public-private partnership, you encounter a lot of technical barriers. In NATO, for example, we cannot simply share classified information with a company. So there are a lot of hurdles that we need to overcome. A lot of the stuff has to be done, I guess, informal, and that's always a bit risky because you don't have clear procedures. So I agree with you. And with the other two speakers, public-private partnership is very important. But it is for an organization like ours not very easy to implement. That's probably all I can say here. I think cyber has led the way, and many of us will follow. We have now in NATO, for example, and this is also interesting for hybrid, we have a completely new policy track called innovation, and basically it's about artificial intelligence, emerging disruptive technologies. In other words, things that can be to the advantage of a hybrid aggressor, but can also be to the advantage of a defender. And so as we wrap our heads around these technologies, I think we will inevitably work more closely together with the private sector. And we've already done a number of seminars and things where we sort of try to narrow down what the problem is and how we can work together more coherently.
Thank you very much, and it's been a great pleasure to moderate this session and a privilege. I just got a note from that we have well exceeded our time reserved, but I must say that all the three presentations have been excellent, and it's very difficult to summarize our message today. I think we agree that there's plenty of work to be done, and then we need to understand better the concepts and also the vocabulary related to the hybrid threats and hybrid warfare, if we use that wording. I recall 20 years ago there was the new concept called controllable information society, launched in the neighboring country to Lithuania, and nowadays when we look the wording and particularly the politics related to the COVID-19 crisis, it's quite interesting to see that the same concept is used again, and particularly the same rhetorics and concepts. So very interesting times, and I would like to thank all three speakers. Thank you very much for taking part to this conference today, and we certainly hope we can turn back to you later on. And I would also like to thank from my behalf, and we certainly look forward to the conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hellenberg, for moderating the third session. We have finished slightly ahead of time, a little bit more than slightly ahead of time. So because we are connected at a distance and the agreements with the speakers have been for very precise start times, our next session will start at exactly 14:40, so that is in just a little bit under 40 minutes. So I suppose it's not coffee break, but a quick lunch break. Thank you.